Welcome to Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy, brought to you by the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. And now, here's your host, Michael Morris.
Welcome to this incredible podcast series, Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy. We've been able to bring you guests with unique knowledge and insights to share their perspective on public policy, what's going on in the world of employment. Are we having the momentum shift forward? What is holding us back? I'm really excited today to bring you a true executive leader in corporate America who has spent 40 years focused on disability inclusion strategies, both at IBM, more recently at JPMorgan Chase. Jim Sinocchi, many of you may be familiar with his wonderful blog, View from the Chair. Others of you have had an opportunity to meet and talk with Jim. What I love about Jim is there's no holding back. We're going to get the story straight and lots of insights that I think are going to really have you think about your own thinking and perhaps even change behavior. So Jim, welcome, and let's dive right into some questions. For the past 6 years, you were the Director of Disability Inclusion at JPMorgan Chase. I wonder if you can explain to our listeners, what was your role there? Why did they bring you on? And how did that role help you promote employment and economic advancement for individuals with disabilities?
Sure. Thank you, Michael, for having me on the podcast. First, I was asked by the firm to start up a disability inclusion program. The bank at the time did have a fine diversity strategy, if you will. And what I was impressed about the bank, not only I was impressed with Chase Bank looking at this, right, the largest bank in the world. Secondly, I found that many people at the bank were humble and honest, which I thrive on, that kind of honesty. And the person that hired me was Pat David. And when she was the managing director of diversity and inclusion. And so when I was hired, she was quite honest about what the bank had. And she said, Jim, we have good programs around women, Black, Hispanic, Asian Americans, GLBT, and all of those plays, and I may have left out one or two, but most of those plays were on their way to getting better. However, and Pat David's honesty struck me. She goes, we don't know what to do about disability inclusion. And I thought that was like an honest, candid view, nothing to feel sorry about, but I was grateful that she said that. And I said, I think you're right. And I think that there are not enough, how should I say, programs or strategies to incorporate people with disabilities. And by the way, every one of your groups at the bank and every one of the groups at IBM also had those similar groups, but people with disabilities were not how should I say this, a priority. And they weren't a priority because the executives, many of them had the compassion, but they didn't know what to do. And I found that honest candor would give me a chance to build something new at Chase based on some of the things I did at IBM. And so my role at the bank was to find effective ways to recruit qualified and talented people with disabilities to work at the firm globally. Now I say globally because the ADA has a US focus. And although some countries have, and when I looked, there were like 9 or 10 countries that had accessibility laws around the world, but it wasn't pronounced. And so we were moving into an area where we could start with the United States with the background of the ADA and move it out into the world, if you will. Second, I wanted to ensure that we had buy-in from the CEO and management to have the tools and hiring strategies in place for any accommodations that were needed. And that was quickly taken care of, because once I did the pre-hiring phase, and I interviewed with 16 executives before I was hired, and I said, why do I have to speak to 16 executives? And they said, because this is a worldwide job and we want everyone to buy in on this thing. Once I was hired, I interviewed privately with Jamie Dimon, the chairman, which was unique. I've run into my chairman at John Akers and Sam Palmisano at IBM. When I got to know them, I was a 30-year plus employee at IBM. But my first day on the job, my first week on the job, I met with Jamie Dimon and we talked about disability inclusion. Then Jamie told me that I want you to go speak with all of my direct reports. So those direct reports would get the strategy for me in terms of what I was trying to do and enlisting their help. And they in turn saying, Jim, we'll help you any way we can. And so I was so proud to be with a company that had the enlightenment to think about this. And the third thing that I had to make sure of is that we could establish pathways, not to just a job, but an opportunity to move people with disabilities into managerial and leadership positions. So that was all talked about at the front, and everyone said, Jim, let's do that. Let's learn together and let's put this, strategy in place. So that's how it started to answer your question.
Fantastic. Jim, how does your life experience, how did it shape your vision and advocacy internally at Chase?
I was pretty angry after I broke my neck body surfing in Puerto Rico in 1980, 1981. I was working for IBM at the time, and on winter break, I was also an assistant coach at City College University, and we took the swim team at City College to Puerto Rico to train, during winter break. And during that time, we do, 2 hours of training in the morning, 2 hours of training in the evening. And then during the day, we were able to go to different places and sightsee and that kind of stuff. Things all college people want to do. And I was I was 21 at the time, right? I was a young man. So while body surfing, and listen, I was an experienced lifeguard. I saved like 15 people during 2 years working at a beach, bringing people in. And when I went body surfing, I came in and broke my neck on a wave. And that I became a C5, C6 quadriplegic. I didn't know what that was. I asked the doctor, am I going to be able to walk? He said, no. I said, will I be able to use my hands? He said, no. And I was just devastated. I didn't know what I was going to do. But I used my status at IBM, because after 18 months at the New York University Medical Center in New York, I was released home. IBM took me right back to work, and I started my career there. And when I retired, I was a corporate director of communications for IBM Corporation. But I used my challenges and failures and incremental successes in terms of how to be a quadriplegic. I was devastated. It had taken me 5 years to clear my head after that injury. And it was still slow going. I didn't know what I was going to do. I felt like I wasn't a man anymore. People stared at me like I was crippled, and I was. I remember holding a little coffee cup attached to my wheelchair, working at IBM when I was in New York. And the kid walked by and threw $1 in my cup, like they would do for people on the street. And I said, son, I don't need your money. I probably make more money than you do at IBM. He says, no, I just want to help. But that showed me that some people cared and wanted to do something. On the other hand, it really pushed my ego down to a point where I didn't know how how I was going to get through life. I knew people looked at me with my so-called deformity, my clenched fists, my leg spasms, and more. At IBM, I learned how to own my disability, work through challenges, and with the help of colleagues who didn't care what I looked like, but instead looked at what I can contribute. Because I did graduate from Colgate University and I had my master's from NYU. And I thank the Lord for letting me have that before I had my accident, because going through those schools and things like that would be almost impossible for me. So I did have a pedigree in terms of degrees. When I was injured in Puerto Rico in 1981 and broke my neck, IBM flew me back to New York in an outfitted Lear jet, where I was taken to the New York City Medical Center. And there for over 6 to 10 months, I was at the Russ Rehabilitation Center, and finally spent 39 years at IBM and made the executive ranks as a quadriplegic. So all of that was daunting. It was a crapshoot in terms of how far I could go, but I got through it.
It's quite a story, and it's true. It's not fiction. And you eventually went, you actually retired at IBM and then started a second career at Chase. What are you most proud of? You did a lot of things that changed corporate culture at Chase. You saw hiring of a lot more people with disabilities in very diverse parts of the bank. But what are you most proud of?
First of all, I'm proud that I proved the strategy I put together worked, and it was understandable to people. As you know, Mike, that able-bodied people, as much as they try to understand disability inclusion, intimately, they don't understand it as well as we do. You know, we still get stares in terms of people looking at you. I remember when I met my wife at IBM. She's able-bodied. We got married, and I went through a lot of discussions with her about what I could do and what I couldn't do. And we talked about children. And my doctors emphasized to me that I couldn't have children because of my injury. Not to be stopped. My wife and I had a child, my son, Jimmy, and I called the doctor. He said, Jim, I told the UK, I said, I know what you told me, but you were wrong. And we had children. And so I always seem to work on things in a way that I try to remain positive about things. I knew the challenges, I knew what I had to do, but even at my jobs at IBM and Chase, I try to, I chase for the blue ribbon. I keep going. Everyone's telling me what I can't do, and I'm trying to say, this is what I've done. Meanwhile, I have a daughter who's an attorney. My son worked for the Department of Defense. When I asked him what he did, he said, Dad, I'll have to kill you because I can't tell you. But we had a family that was as normal as anybody else's. And I know I make light of it, but my life is not just about disability. It's about love, compassion, and I can relate to what you do. If you have children, I understand what having children is. If you have a spouse, I know what a spouse is. I am not isolated from society that way, but society still looks at us that way. So when hired at Chase, I outlined a strategy based on the 4 A's, what I call the 4 A's. And the 4 A's were attitude, assimilation, accessibility, and accommodations. And the reason why I chose these words and made them simple is because everybody thinks disability is complicated in terms of implementing strategies. And it isn't. If you think about it and you put it into words that people can understand, because they're not medical people, they're not doctors, they're not psychiatrists, they're people, and they want to understand how to do things and not feel that they're discriminating against anybody, but also getting used to looking at a person with a quote unquote deformity. How do I cope with that? How do I deal with that? So attitude, assimilation, and accessibility and accommodations made that easy for corporations to understand. And again, I did the first 3 A's at IBM, and I added the assimilation when I came to Chase. So attitude has to do, what's your approach to dealing with people who have disabilities? Do you shake hands? What words do you use? I had some people kneel in front of me in my wheelchair because they wanted eye contact. I said, no, you can stand up. I don't have a problem with that. So the idea is getting into a rhythm where people can communicate without feeling that they're going to make a mistake or say something that they shouldn't say. But each of these areas help shape a positive, necessary strategy to support people with disabilities. So attitude is, how do you approach people with disabilities and welcome them into your culture? Assimilation means, how do you not just hire them, but how do you think about a career path to move them through the business, to get them promoted? Most people with disabilities stay in the same job for years. No one ever thinks of them as leaders. And that's one of the things that I wanted to change. Accessibility is common. It's turning our technology systems into something that anybody could use. You know, blind, deaf, people with physical disabilities, with myself. How do I get to that technology to not only make me work better, but even make me an executive to say, I know how to use this technology and I can access it. Finally, we talk about accommodations. We had a $1 million+ program at Chase delivering accommodations to people with various disabilities. Everything from reframing buildings in terms of making them accessible. We created a captioning team at the firm. We have captioners working for Chase as full-time employees to handle our deaf population there. And it's just pick up the phone and go. We even put captioning on Zoom at the bank in terms of every time we have a meeting, we have a captioner come on, a deaf person can join and participate in regular meetings with everybody else. And so each of these areas help shape a positive, necessary strategy to support people with disability. Finally, at the end of my term here, in the last year, the 4 A's led to another A, accountability. Because you could have the 4 A's in terms of what you do, but is the business going to be accountable when new people come in and make sure they get the same hiring experience at the bank? And so at the firm, as we hired people with the skills to work at the bank, we provided the resources needed to help them successfully perform their jobs. So that's what we try to do. And that's the match. What's your disability? What do you need? Can we do it? If we can't do it in the bank, we go outside the bank. And I had a budget for accommodations that was rich in terms of getting what we needed done for our people. And again, as much as I wanted to hire people with disabilities, I was limited to hiring people who were qualified to work at the bank. So this wasn't a charity. This wasn't a gift. But this was a thing that said, if you have the skills to work here, we'll work with you to help you work here and do as much as you can. And I had to stop there. At the bottom end of this is, over the 6 years, I developed a passion for helping people with disabilities around the world in any way we could, to share our strategies, to talk to other companies, to go to other countries and talk about what we were doing in order to say, this is slow work, it's hard work, but it can be done. Your disabled people have skills, and we have to think about the limitations in terms of education. As you know, when people have disabilities, education is hard to get. Getting through school, getting through, how do you climb stairs in a school that was built, 50 years ago with no elevators, right? So those are the challenges in life, but we did what we could at the bank in terms of that genre that we were in. But I shared everything I could about disability inclusion so other people can, piggyback on what we did and cultivate other types of inclusion strategies, where whether you were a small business, a medium-sized business, or a large business, those layers of access are different across the board. And one size doesn't fit all. So we got a lot. We still have a lot to do.
I want to shift us a little bit to a topic you have often talked about, and that's public policy. Historically, we know public policy continues to pose barriers to the employment and economic advancement of people with disabilities. What public policies are particularly vexing and holding people with disabilities back from these objectives?
I still think if you go back to my 4 A's and 5 if you call it accountability, we still have, I think, a long way to go. I want to help as many people as we can. Years ago, there was an educational ad created by the advertising agency Young and Rubicon with a tagline that said, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." It was with the United Negro College Fund Scholarship Program for Black students. But I find that it's also appropriate for people with disabilities today. As you know, we have brought in people with disabilities, physical as well as mental, and we have a neurodiverse program. And we also have, under our ADD program, we know that there are 600 types of mental illness and other disabilities around, which I don't think anybody can really count how many disabilities there are. So the journey becomes, as a qualified person comes into your business and they have a disability, how do you help them engage in work? And that'll always be the problem going forward. And the idea just to be aware of it. So today, I think technology is the great equalizer for people with disabilities around the world. And I think the smart companies will find ways for what I call blended employment, which allows people with disabilities and others either to work from home on their specific challenges, needs, or lifestyles. But of course, they must be qualified for the work they are performing. And you must have heard it today, as I did. A lot of people, because of COVID, prefer to work at home. The problem with that is working in a firm like Chase or IBM, the camaraderie there is important in terms of how work gets done. You meet people, you know people, and you should not isolate them. People with disabilities, to our own fault, is feeling comfortable at home and doing the same thing, but you miss out on the interaction, which really helps you get promoted or get new ideas and new learnings. And I think we have to work on a balance in terms of getting people to work. And if they can, go to work a couple of days a week or 3 days a week, but not, people with disabilities should not want to stay home. I have one of the severest disabilities you could have. And I enjoy going to work every day. I enjoy taking the train, even though it's hard, but I enjoy doing all that. So people with disabilities and even the able-bodied people say, well, I'd rather work from home, but you miss the whole environment of what work life is all about. And I think that if we keep people with disabilities segregated, we will never get the recognition in terms of what we could deliver to our economy and to our humanity that we want to. We have to be out there. I'm out there as a father, as a husband, as a grandfather.
I've heard you speak about, in terms of public policies that really are, one step forward, 2 steps back, perhaps, in terms of our somewhat antiquated Social Security rules. And I wonder if you can share with our listeners some of your viewpoints and, how can what needs to change?
I did this about 6 years ago when I was going to some events with people. I think I was in Texas at the time. I wanted to enable people with disabilities on Social Security to work. And I think the government really has to rethink the policy that says you give people money to stay on Social Security and they have nothing to do, basically. They're there to live. My thought was, let people who are getting Social Security benefits, allow them to work. allow them to get a job and pay taxes. Whatever work they could find, they should be able to do with the aid. The biggest dilemma on this has been medical benefits. So when you work for a large corporation, as I have, we have excellent medical plans, right? But when you're on Social Security, you're even on a welfare type program, or you go on Social Security disability and get that. But why stop us from working? Whatever we can do, we should be able to do, and legitimately, get paid, have a tax form, and pay taxes. The idea of just taking care, this idea came back years ago where people with disabilities were considered, not able to be employed. And that's changed with technology and everything else. So what we were thinking is at Chase is people on Social Security should be able to work, keep their benefits, and pay taxes. People with disabilities should not be paid lower wages while working, as we do have instances of that now in the government. They should be on par with able-bodied workers in similar jobs. Based on a policy brief that JPMC published earlier this year, 4.4 million working age adults with a disability received an average monthly benefit of about $600 per month. In 2001, to be eligible for SSI, monthly income should be less than $794 for an individual and less than $1,191 for a married couple. So these maximum benefit amounts are below the federal poverty level. SSI has an earnings offset that imposes a high margin on tax work, $1 for every $2 earned, 50% on income over $65 per month. You can't live on that. So why not let people work and pay taxes on the other side? It'll never come out equal, but it's not a giveaway, but it gives people hope to get a skill and do something. So I think we've got to change policies like that. It's time.
Yeah, the income and asset limits are degrading disincentives that are created for people who really do want to work, and yet, of course, not everyone works for wonderfully large companies, as you said, and so they need access to healthcare too, that's tied to these kinds of Social Security benefits. But the whole system has to be rethought, and you've made those points. I've heard you make them eloquently over and over again. Business culture is a lot a part of increasing a diverse and inclusive workforce. And I'm wondering if some people say we're beginning to make a lot of progress. There are millions of jobs going unfilled. Corporations are looking at people with disabilities and others in new ways. How has that played out for you? And do you think it's a trend that can continue?
I think the ideas are out there, but people are slow. Like, I don't have the power to make it happen. If you gave me a wand, I would try to do this. But, we talked about the Social Security issue. I was chair of the Airline Carrier Access Act for the last 2 years. And we pushed for airline equity in terms of getting our wheelchairs on planes. About 2 months ago, I got a notice that Buttigieg had said that it's probably likely that they'll be able to ride in wheelchairs on planes now, making seats available. But I mean, and I mention that now because I spent all that time pushing for that. Of course, some of the airlines claim that they would lose up to $1 billion in the, I think that's right, up to $1 billion in terms of changing seats going forward. But they don't take into account that when people could travel on and I have flown in a plane in a wheelchair, by the way, Southwest Airlines one time, and I thought it was a dream and it wasn't, but I did it. It's possible. And, people with disabilities travel in packs, right? Grandma goes to Disney World with the kids, mom and dad go, and, we'll line up. But the humanity of this is what I'm looking for. And I think we're getting closer to that kind of understanding. So I mentioned the ACAA in terms of, which was a terrific experience for me, and the other 30 plus people that were on those meetings helping to improve airline travel. But I say that based on your point in terms of we've got to tackle societal issues in that way. Look at it. Let's have the science in terms of it and make sure it's reasonable. I don't push for anything that's unreasonable. I say, can we make a reasonable approach to fixing things like the Social Security issue, like airline travel? And my bear with the Airline Carrier Act is they won't allow me to sit on the plane in a wheelchair, but they'll take my money for the two people that have to go with me to fly just to get me someplace. So I'm paying more money as a disabled person and not getting the service, basically. Why do I have to pay more to fly? And so we've got to look at society and say, how could we balance? And I was always about balance. I don't think I'm a maniacal guy that says this has to get done. I like to work with people on things, but it's going too slow for me and others. But I think we'll get there in terms of the new thinking that's come out in the 6 years that I was at Chase, actually, in terms of what I was able to influence at the time. And I don't always get my way, but I get a chance to push the ideas out, if that helps with your answer.
You're probably familiar that more individuals with disabilities are pursuing self-employment, starting their own companies, having the opportunity to be founders, entrepreneurs. What do you think the reasons are for that trend? And how can corporations do more to support small businesses created by people with disabilities?
Well, you heard from my colleague, Beth Daly, I think, a while back when we were trying to do that. And the idea is we want to push that idea. We wanted to get to people with disabilities who run small businesses. We also had a strategy and they're still working on it now since I left, how do we become the bank for people with disabilities in terms of normalizing banking with them and getting them to work and bring these entrepreneurs into the fold, into bank with us, but start their own businesses. And they do it with their families and they have other help. And I think it's a warm idea. I really like it, but it's going to take a little time to make sure that, and I know you were part of this with us, make the connections with the SBA loans with them and banks and try to make this a reality. And you know what? Although I sit in a wheelchair, I've been in a wheelchair for 40 years or so. I still have a brain. My head is not disabled in terms of I live in the real world. I drive, I talk to people, I travel, I do different things, but I do them differently. And once we get over that, I think we'll be a better society in a better world in terms of doing that. Working home is fine. And I always tell people, go to work and get the experience because you make partnerships, you meet people, you get different ideas. When you're working from home alone, it's kind of like you're blocked in. You don't get new ideas. You don't get fresh examples. You don't get to meet people. And meeting people is important in our humanity here in terms of making connections and figuring out other things to do. We've just got to try our best to do that. We have to enable that kind of work.
As you think back over your careers at both IBM and Chase, you don't have to pick on those two companies, but it's part of your experience. You've interacted with corporate leadership of many companies. Is there? It's always people are looking for, is there one thing, is there one strategy that you wish there was more of an uptake? Groups like Disability In, they've got hundreds of corporations, CEOs signing on to Disability In inclusive policies. But From your perspective, as both an executive, as someone who's lived 40 years with disabilities, what would you like to see change more rapidly?
That's a good question because I've been thinking about it this week. Ableism is still a problem. People that are humane, are compassionate, and feel sorry for us. And I don't want to be felt sorry for. And I think the ableism gets in the way. Some people have expectations that people with disabilities should behave a certain way. We're not allowed to get angry. We're not allowed to make our point the way other people do. I don't get to go to certain meetings or other things because I'm a distraction. That is still out in the workforce. It's out in our society. It really comes to the fore when people within an organization can say, I'm a woman, I have a child with Down syndrome or who's autistic, I need help. So, companies feel responsible for that. But in general and out in society, it's a different play. I remember when my son was born and he was about, 5 or 6 years old, and we were going to the mall with his mom and his sister. And it was one of his first forays out with us like that, and I was with them. And he turned to his mother and said, Mom, why are all these people looking at us? He realized we were different because I was in a wheelchair. And so he went through some challenges as a young boy and going up. And when he realized I was different, like when I couldn't play ball with him, he got angry and ran away. And so that hurt me, but we worked through it. He's a great guy, my son. But I saw that with my own eyes in my family, knowing what society, I don't know, really thinks or does, that they're not aware of this. And people with disabilities and families with disabilities feel this. We're always in the way. That kind of, when I go to the theater with my wife, I heard someone whisper over my shoulder, those goddamn wheelchairs. So those things happen. And I don't know that they'll ever leave us, but I think it's still something that we have to work on. I hope that gets to your point. I still, as long as I've done this, I probably don't notice it as much, but it's still out there that we're different.
Let me leave you with this last question as we look ahead over the next 5 years. Are you optimistic, cynical? How would you describe your view of what I hope is still huge opportunities for economic gains, employment gains, not just, as you said, employment, but really career advancing opportunities, heads of companies, being on boards of directors of major corporations. Are we going to get there over the next 5 years?
I think we will get there with some people. I still think people confuse disability with being too much work or they don't fit in. I'd like to see more people with disability leaders in corporate America and around the world. There are some out there. I've looked them up periodically over the years, but they're few and far between. Even though they're out there working, they don't seem to make it up to the C-suite, right? I'd like to see people with disabilities progress academically. Getting an education when you're a young disabled person is a chore, getting up through all the systems and the politics and all that. How do you go to high school, junior high school, public school? Some of the buildings are old, you can't get in. Everything becomes difficult. And I think the current DEI construct must better embrace disability. Every time we hear this diversity, equity, inclusion, it seems to cut out the disabled population. I found that I have to push my way in the door to say, we're here, I've got Black people who are disabled. I have gay people who are disabled. I have Hispanic people who are disabled. I have to remind people, even though they have those groups, they tend not to look at their disabled population. That happened both at IBM and my former company too. I think the current DI construct must better embrace disability, and disability is still a challenge for large, medium, and small businesses. It still is. I don't think we're losing the war, but it's going a little more slowly than I would like.
Appreciate your comments. Any last further comment you'd like to share with our listeners, many of whom, whether people with disabilities, in public policy, leadership positions, in corporate America, what kind of a call to action? What would you like to see people do?
I'd say, being disabled is just hard to cope with. We all know it's not easy, right? And discrimination and ableism will always be with us. This includes areas such as competition, travel, accommodations, education, bureaucracy, unconscious bias, etc. On the other hand, I'm encouraged by more supplier diverse initiatives, which I've seen, which includes disability. At the corporate level, I've seen participation over the years. The main concern is the lack of PWD entrepreneurs. I think we need more of them. I also think that the disability narrative has expanded in a positive way. I think progress is still slow from where I sit. Maybe it's because I'm an executive and I want it faster. I'm the same as any executive, right? That wants better progress. I think discrimination continues, and disability products are expensive. Cars, medicine, wheelchairs, canine service, animals, and so on. The things that people with disabilities need come at a cost, and the cost is not cheap. And so we have delineation in terms of price points for people with disabilities that have power wheelchairs versus manual wheelchairs. Or if you look at our elderly in equipment that's hard to get and hard to pay for and hard to fix, all of those things need to be looked at. And I think it can be looked at and become much better to help people with disabilities. And everything with the disabled, as you know, costs more. My wheelchairs cost $30,000 each. I could not get around without, my chairs, and I have a backup chair just in case I can't. One breaks down, I have a buy to get someplace. So these are all the things people with disabilities think about that's really not affordable for most of the disabled population.
And really that ties back to what's those extra costs? How can we manage them in terms of public policy, again, in terms of what our healthcare system pays for, and really the effort to understand long-term services and supports, not just acute healthcare. But I appreciate the time with you today. As always, candid comments. I think you've given our listeners a lot to think about.
Thank you. And just one last thing before I go. There was a soul song I used to like. To quote the song lyric, it says, "The world won't get any better if we just let it be." And so my job is to fight as much as I can and change the world to be a better place for our folks and children with disabilities. That's what I strive for.
Thank you, Jim.
You've been listening to Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy, brought to you by the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.